I've worked in Grandpa's shop for most of my life. It's been the first job for not just me, but all my siblings and most of my cousins. Grandpa runs a little pawn shop downtown, the kind of place that sells antiques as well as modern stuff, and he does pretty well. I don't think I've ever seen him worry about paying rent, and he can afford to pay us kids better than any other place in the neighborhood. All the other kids quit on it after a while, but I enjoyed the work, and Grandpa always said I had a real knack for it. You keep at it, kid, and someday this old shop will be yours. Grandpa and I live above the shop. He offered me the spare room after Grandma died a few years back, and it's been a pretty good arrangement. Every evening, he turns on the radio and cracks a beer, and we sit around and drink, and he tells stories from back in the day. The radio never seemed to make any noise, and I asked him why he kept it around. He told me it was something he'd had for a long time, and it was special. I asked how the old radio was special, and he said that was a long story if I had time for it. I said I didn't have anything else to do but sit here and listen to the rain, and Grandpa settled in as the old thing clicked and clunked in the background. Grandpa grew up in the early 60s. Technically, he grew up in the 40s and 50s, but in a lot of his stories, it doesn't really seem like his life began until 1962. He describes it as one of the most interesting times of his life, and a lot of it is because of his father, my great-grandpa. He grew up in Chicago, and the town was just starting to get its feet under it after years of war and strife. His mother had died when he was 14, and his father opened a pawn shop with the money he'd gotten from her life insurance policy. They weren't called pawn shops at that point. I think Grandpa said what my great-grandfather had was a brokerage or something. But all that mattered was that people came in and tried to sell him strange and wondrous things sometimes. Great-grandpa had run the place with his family, which consisted of my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and my great-uncle Terry. Great-great-grandma lived with them, but she didn't help out around the shop much. She had dementia, so she mostly stayed upstairs in her room as she kicked and waited to die. They lived above the shop in a little 3-bedroom flat. It was a little tight, Grandpa said, but they did all right. Grandpa worked at the pawn shop since he needed money to pay for his own apartment, and he said they got some of the strangest things sometimes, especially if his Uncle Terry was behind the counter. Uncle Terry was an odd duck, and that's coming from a family that wasn't strictly normal. Dad would usually buy things that he knew he could sell easily, appliances, tools, cars, furniture, that sort of thing. Uncle Terry, however, would often buy things that were a little less easy to move. He bought a bunch of old movie props, once from a guy who claimed they were genuine props from an old Bela Lugosi film, and Dad lost his shirt on them. Uncle Terry was also the one who bought that jewelry that turned out to be stolen. But that was okay, because they turned it into the police, and the reward was worth way more than they had spent on it. Terry was like a metronome. He'd make the worst choices, and then the best choices, and sometimes they were the same choices all at once. So, of course, Terry had been the one to buy the radio. Dad had been sick for about a week, and it had been bad enough that the family had worried he might not come back from it. People in those times didn't always get over illnesses, and unless you had money to go see a doctor, you either got better or you didn't. He had finally packed it all up and got better, and was ready to return to work. So he comes downstairs to the floor where Terry is sitting there reading some kind of artsy-fartsy magazine, and he looks over and sees that they've taken in a new radio. This big old German model with dark wood cabinet and dials that looked out of a Frankenstein's lab. He thinks that looks pretty good, and he congratulates Terry, telling him everybody wants a good radio, and that'll be real easy to sell. Terry looks up over his magazine and tells him it ain't a radio. Dad asks him just what the hell it is then, and Terry lays down his magazine and gives him the biggest, creepiest grin you've ever seen. It's a spirit radio. Terry announces like that's supposed to mean something. I was working when Dad and Uncle Terry had that conversation, and Dad just pinched the bridge of his nose and shook his head like he was trying not to bash Terry's skull in.